All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s, when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you compare direct auto rates from a variety of companies so you can find a great one, even if it's not with them. Quote today at Progressive.com to find a rate that works with your budget. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, January 9th, 1964, President Lyndon Johnson called on Congress to declare a, quote, unconditional war on poverty. This was during Johnson's State of the Union speech. Technically, it was January 8th, but we're doing the show January 9th. In this State of the Union speech, he proclaimed that, quote, our aim is not only to relieve the symptoms of poverty, but to cure it and, above all, to prevent it. A lot of notable and fairly successful programs would be folded into this effort, a lot of them, of course, with us still today. This was an attempt to restructure the federal government to help support people in need. Of course, we're in another moment where this country is debating that kind of sweeping legislation to shore up our economy and social services and sort of rethink how we take care of people who need help. So let's discuss the war on poverty as a policy effort and as a branding exercise. So here to do that, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hi, Jody.
Hey there.
Thoughts on it as branding? A good move to call it a war. In 1964, I don't think Americans' appetite for war is like super high, right? Cold War, Vietnam's not going great.
This became a war on everything, a war on drugs, a war on crime. The war on poverty, though, I don't think works very well. There are other, a campaign to end poverty, maybe? I don't know. I'm trying to think of other things that have a softer touch attached to it.
Well, and you hear in his words, right, our aim is not only to relieve the symptoms of poverty, but to cure it and, above all, to prevent it. There he's using kind of a medical analogy, right, that this is an ill that needs to be cured. But I think that the reason that he talks about it as a war on poverty is that was the thing that had marshaled so many American resources and had allowed for the expansion of the growth of government in the 1940s. Americans in 1964 would have remembered that all-in effort to win World War II. They were living in the middle of the Cold War. So the idea of war being a uniting metaphor, a nationalist metaphor that people were familiar with, and even like kind of not happy about, but felt inspired by.
Yeah, it's mobilizing, and there's an urgency to it. You know, like a campaign is not something that you get excited by or sort of like prepared to move. War is like everybody rally the troops. I mean, all of the metaphors that you could go along with, like the military, it feels appropriate for something like this.
Yeah, I mean, there's very few things that galvanize this country like we're going to war.
Like war.
It is interesting. I mean, you mentioned war on drugs, the war on terror, obviously a very controversial and sort of like imperfect way to phrase that. I think that this is sort of similar. It's like, I appreciate the signaling that calling something a war on means and how seriously it means. When a president says that, how seriously it means they're going to take it. I also think that without that other language that you pointed out, Nikki, about kind of, we're talking about conditions here. We're talking about sort of an underlying issue. The war metaphor is imperfect and maybe puts people in the wrong mindset. I will say, I was surprised that we didn't hear a little bit more of that kind of language around COVID. And I do think, whether explicitly using the language of war on COVID or some sort of just like big unifying language of our country is going to defeat this common enemy, never really emerged. I don't think Trump wanted to or was in a position to really do that. But part of me was also like, man, couldn't someone have gotten in Trump's ear and been like, hey, this can be your war, right? Like, this can be it.
The war on
COVID.
Yeah.
There were so many sort of metaphors about World War II that were floating around at the start of COVID, right? We were going to turn factories that were making, consumer goods into factories making masks and hand sanitizer and all of these things. But
and hunker down.
There wasn't the kind of rhetoric, I think, that mobilized people, probably because that war on language has been used in some pretty suspect ways in the intervening years.
Yeah. Let's get to the details of the actual policies, but I know I'm just lingering on the branding here. But I've been thinking also a lot about like Build Back Better as a sort of like imperfect message, but in part because I don't think 20 years from now, even if the legislation passes and is successful and reworks the economy, I don't think Build Back Better is going to stick in people's minds in the way that War on Poverty did or New Deal did or sort of these other sort of brandings. That said, that's weird. Like, it wasn't until just a couple months ago, well into the Build Back Better conversation, that I actually stopped and was like, it's actually not that bad of a phrase. I get it. Like, we're not just going
It's good alliteration.
It's good alliteration. The idea is like, we're not just going to try and hit the reset button to where things were before COVID. We're going to use this opportunity to build back better. But it took me, someone who's like fairly engaged and has been hearing this phrase over and over and over, it took me like months to actually like get it. And so that's probably not a good sign.
But I will say that like, it's, to me, when I think about the war on poverty, what's interesting about what Johnson does with the war on poverty is it's also part of his Great Society plan. And the Great Society plan is enormous. So I should say, this was years ago, I can't even remember when, but I went to President Johnson's presidential library in Austin, Texas, which is quite impressive. I think if anybody gets a chance to go, they should. But man, you see the massive amounts of legislation that took place, perhaps more than any other president, certainly of the time. It's incredible to see the progressive acts that were coming out and how he was trying to help people at every single level in their lives.
Yeah, so many people focus on the first 100 days of the New Deal, but what Lyndon Johnson was able to do in, here the war on poverty announcement comes, he'd become president in late November of 1963, so just a few months in. He launches the war on poverty. He starts the drive for the Civil Rights Act. He's doing so much, and because he had come up through Congress and through the Senate, he had the legislative skills to actually get things done, which I think is why you get these days a lot of Biden-Johnson comparisons, because Biden spent so many years in the Senate that was supposed to represent a kind of strength in his presidency that perhaps other less experienced politicians wouldn't be able to do.
Yeah. Generally, the sort of four tent poles of this war on poverty are the creation of Medicare and Medicaid, expanded Social Security benefits, the Food Stamp Act, the Economic Opportunity Act, and then the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which established Title I to subsidize schools with impoverished students. But yeah, I mean, just this sort of real holistic look at poverty as something that needs to be addressed throughout someone's life. I mean, it really does evoke, I think, a lot of what's happening now around this conversation around what people refer to as the human infrastructure bill that that Biden is trying to push through. The other thing that struck me here, I think, Nikki, to your point, Johnson is clearly skilled and uses sort of his history of how to wrangle Congress. But I think there's also it's important to keep in mind there's a flow of momentum building to this moment over the previous years. Kennedy, before his assassination, had made poverty a big part of, his agenda. I think there was just a lot of reporting and sort of public awareness and building public awareness. So I don't know. For some reason, that just feels important to me to think of Johnson as someone who pushed it over the line as opposed to kind of out of nowhere reprioritized where America was going to look.
Yeah. No, it's really important that that case was being made because so much of the public and political conversation in the 1950s had been about American excess, right? That it was a country that had grown kind of fat and languid because, people had lots of money after the war and they were able to move to the suburbs and we had become this kind of decadent society. And what was missing in that conversation, what was invisible in American politics was the large percentage of Americans, something like 20% of Americans who lived in poverty, and a poverty that felt very different from poverty today because you didn't have things like medical care. You didn't have things like food stamps. People went hungry. People went unhoused. They went unclothed because there weren't these kind of resources to help them out. And so Johnson, as he's thinking through how you address that kind of abject poverty, one, it's, making sure people have more money, but it's also taking away the harshest parts of the conditions of poverty, like hunger, like a lack of medical care. And it makes a real difference. People, something like 20% of Americans had never seen a doctor, and that number drops to something around 8%. The poverty rate is cut almost in half. So it makes a real impact.
And what it also does is it establishes a floor, right? A way of saying like, no one should go below this level of living or quality of life in terms of their health or their education or their ability to eat. And so by saying like there is a safety net there for you to get food, for your children to get access to early education, which was so important. I think of the Head Start program and all that it did for children who were living in impoverished communities, to give them the Head Start that they needed, or to get them in school earlier, as young as the age of 3, is a huge relief for people who often had to wait years, sometimes never, getting these, benefits.
Yeah.
I also think it's important to think of it in the Cold War context, too, because the United States is making the argument in this moment that capitalism and democracy are better than communism, and Soviets are using as propaganda the sort of wretched poverty in different parts of the United States. And so one of the things that Johnson is trying to do is he's trying to undercut that argument to say, no, we actually take care of the poor here. That's not just a communist philosophy.
Yeah. I do think, Kellie, your point about changing the sort of norms is so important. We're seeing that play out now. I mean, it is interesting, though. It may not be the case. I mean, like that whole debate about the child tax credit, they did it for 1 year. It cut child poverty, tremendously, but now it's expiring, and so I think the gamble there was, once it's there and it's a norm. But I think you can also point to things like, it's the case in New York City, but I think it's going to happen around the country, but like universal pre-K and 3K as just like a norm. And I think like 5-10 years from now, people will that will be an expectation that is part of the deal that with government, and I do think you change those norms, and sometimes you just sort of implement something, it proves out to work, and then that just sort of changes the point at which the next negotiations and the debates sort of happen. So I think that's a big part of what we're seeing playing out
I
now.
hope that's the case. As someone with young kids, I need a new floor. Pre-K is a game changer.
Yeah.
So and the earlier studies also show that people who live in poverty, the earlier they're entered into educational programs or into school, the better they do. It also showed that people who actually have large amounts of wealth, the longer their child stays at home, the better. So it's an interesting sort of dynamic. But having those interventions really create long-term changes for a child's future.
Well, that kind of goes back to the way you evoked the sort of medical language and the sort of thought of this as a disease, and you sort of need to have early intervention. You need to have care and compassion throughout, and poverty is not just a sort of condition in one moment that you can flip a switch on and off. It is something that needs to be addressed early and in an ongoing sort of more systemic way. And I do think the war on poverty started it, and I think we're, I don't know. In the 80s, we sort of snapped back a little bit more towards the idea that like poverty was a personal failing or whatever, or a moral failing. But I do think like in some fundamental way, it did help sort of get people to think about conditions more than sort of individual actors.
And also that this can be a two-pronged process. I mean, I think there's the old adage of give a man a fish and he'll eat for a day, teach him to fish and he'll eat for a lifetime. But it's like you can give a person a fish and teach them to fish at the same time.
Exactly.
Like, it's not either or. But oftentimes that is how the legislation has sort of been split up to this either or dichotomy, and it really does require everything in order for people to be successful for the long term.
I mean, it's also worth noting that 7 months after he declares unconditional war on poverty, Johnson also goes to war with Vietnam and ratchets up U.S. involvement there. And that becomes the story of his presidency. As more and more money is being spent on Vietnam, these programs are being neglected, they're getting their funds cut. And in many ways, he makes a trade-off between this metaphorical war and the real war that he's waging. And what ends up happening is, in a way, he loses them both. We can talk elsewhere about the war in Vietnam, but even though these programs were very effective, they start to get a reputation in part because of pushback from the right against them, but also because of their underfunding as not being as effective as they could be, as having some failures that Johnson himself recognized before he died, that he had traded the war on poverty for the war in Vietnam and that it was a bad trade.
And I think that's been a big part of this, this last year or two, is just a realization that there is still a lot of deep poverty and insecurity in this country. And that floor, the ceiling has just grown so exponentially, and the floor has just, if it's risen, it has risen so, at such a smaller rate. I mean, a couple generations later after the war on poverty, the poverty rate has fallen to 15% from 19%. I mean, that's something, but it's, maybe not something to take a victory lap about.
Yeah. I also think, something that needs to be considered is that it takes a really long time in order to generate wealth and to sort of have a job or a career that will allow you to accumulate wealth. But it doesn't take very much at all for wealth that's gained to be lost. So a job loss, an illness, can literally shoot you to the bottom with rocket speed if you don't have protections in place to keep people, to allow people to sustain the wealth that they have created. And so, that's sort of the story of American capitalism at large, and that's a larger story at that. But, it's definitely something to think about, that you can fall to the bottom and then get stuck. And it's very difficult to rise and get stuck.
Yeah.
Well, and to Kellie's point about the precarity of poverty and how that still hasn't been fully addressed, there was a great quote by one of the editors of the American Prospect, Paul Starr, who said, "The idea of a war on poverty without strengthening the hand of labor was a great mistake." And it is true. In the years following Johnson's administration, there's deindustrialization, increased job precarity, and that job precarity leads to more poverty. And so by not securing labor, by not making sure that workers were able to make enough money to keep out of poverty, right? Because people in poverty, by and large, have full-time jobs, but they don't make enough money in order to get out of poverty. And so that feels like a pretty astute point.
Yeah.
One final note as we wrap up here, it is the case that January 8th is marked as War on Poverty Day. I don't know anyone who marks that day, but you don't celebrate. No, but part of me is like, I mean, look, we have Veterans Day and Memorial Day, and what is in May 8th on Victory in Europe Day. I mean, maybe should be a War on Poverty Day. Maybe that's part of the sort of branding exercise. I'll wear a pin or take a moment or something, but keep it in the consciousness, because of all those wars, that's just probably the one that's still ongoing.
The
right?
one that's ongoing and matters perhaps the most.
Exactly.
But it also has to be more than symbolic too, because it's like you can acknowledge poverty, and then it's poor people who are forgotten about the most too. So.
All right. Well, we will leave it there, marking the War on Poverty Day for this year. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
The richest nation on earth can afford to win it. We cannot afford to lose it. It will not be a short or easy struggle. No single weapon or strategy will suffice. But we shall not rest until that war is won.
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. If you feel like you're wasting time and money with your current business software, or just want to know what you could be missing, then you'll need to join the millions of others who have switched to Odoo. Odoo is the affordable, all-in-one management software with a library of fully integrated business applications that help you get more done in less time for a fraction of the price. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Odoo, modern management made simple.
Radiotopia.